Let's evaluate the function f of x is equal to the absolute value of x. So this f of x symbol is another way to say y. If I wrote y is equal to the absolute value of x, we're saying the same thing. So y and f of x are interchangeable. So this is just a new symbol, read f of x, to replace the symbol y. So if you want to evaluate this function, like let's say you want to figure out f of 3, that just means in the symbol that wherever you see an x, you put a 3. So this would be the absolute value of 3. And I know the absolute value of 3 is equal to 3. So that being said, we figured out that f of 3 is equal to 3. But what does this mean? This is the y value when x equals 3. So there's no y resting anywhere over here. You just have to know what this symbol represents. If you see f of x or f of a number, we really mean a y value. Likewise, we could do this for another point. Like you could say, well, what's f of negative 5? What is this thing? And before we even compute it, whatever the answer is going to be the y value when x is equal to negative 5. But to actually compute it, we would go back to our formula. Wherever we see an x, we replace it with a negative 5. So this is the absolute value of negative 5, which, if you simplify it, equals positive 5. So again, there's no y sitting anywhere over here, but it is equivalent to say that y is equal to 5. And that's because these two ideas, these two symbols, mean the same thing. So using this new notation, I would like to graph these two different functions on the same xy plane. One of them is f of x is equal to the absolute value of x, and the other is equal to, well, g of x is equal to the absolute value of x minus 4. These functions are very closely related. The only difference is that we're subtracting 4 in the function g of x. So here's going to be my approach. I'm going to choose a few points for x and solve for their corresponding y values. I'm going to plot them and use that to sketch my entire graph. So let's start with f of x. You can choose any numbers that you want. I'm going to start by saying, all right, for negative 5, what happens if I plug this into the function f of x? Doing that is going to allow us to figure out what the corresponding y value is. So that is, if we take negative 5 and plug it into this function, we get the absolute value of negative 5, and that changes to positive 5. This symbol right here means what is the y value when x is equal to negative 5, and we figured out it is positive 5. This allows us to plot the point negative 5 for x and positive 5 for y. We'll do this a couple more times. Let's see. Maybe I'll do an x value of 0. What's the corresponding y value? Well, I would take the x value and put it into my function. That's the absolute value of 0, and that simplifies to 0. So this symbol f of 0 means what is the y value when x is equal to 0? And we figured out that it is, well, 0. That means we can plot the point 0, 0. And I'll do one more. I guess I'll use positive 5. I think that'll be enough to get an idea of what this function looks like. Okay, if you want to know the y value at x equals 5, you would go to your function, you would put 5 in place of x, you would simplify it back to positive 5, and so when x is equal to positive 5, the function is equal to 5, and that means the y value is 5. You could plot a whole lot more points. Like you could do negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 1, 2, and 3. But what you're going to see is a graph that has a V shape to it. That's going to be the general form of the absolute value function. It's going to look something like this. Doesn't have to be a perfect sketch. I just want to have something that resembles f of x, a rough sketch. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing, but for g of x. Same idea, though. What we're going to do is choose a couple of x values and solve for the corresponding y values. I think I'm going to use the same exact x values. So to start with, I'm going to say, well, when x is equal to -5, what is the corresponding y value on the function g? In symbols, that would be figure out what g of -5 is equal to. Okay, so you put -5 into x for this function here. So that's going to be the absolute value of -5 minus 4. Well, the absolute value of -5 is 5 minus 4, and 5 minus 4 is 1. All this work means that when x is equal to -5, the y value of the function g is equal to 1. This thing. So at -5, I'm going to plot 1. Okay, let's repeat this process, but let's try x is equal to 0. So we'll do this again. Again, what's the y value? In symbols, we write that as g of 0. That would be the absolute value of 0 minus 4. Well, that's the same thing as 0 minus 4, or simply -4. So when x is equal to 0, the y value in the function g is -4. I'll write that right here. And we'll do one more. I'll also look at x is equal to +5. What's the corresponding y value? In symbols, that is figure out or compute g of 5. That's the absolute value of 5, then minus 4, which is the same thing as 5 minus 4, which is 1. And we get this spot here. X equals 5, y is equal to 1. So before I left off writing y is equal to the result that we got, but that's only because that's what this symbol means right here. If you see g of 5, this means what's the y value on the function g at the x value of 5. Okay, I think that's enough to sketch the entire function. It looks something like this. Not a perfect sketch, just a rough sketch. Okay, now the last part to this is, well, how do these two functions relate to each other? I mean, they're very similar looking graphs if you look at the pictures, but they are slightly different. In the graph of g, this minus 4 means you're subtracting 4 from every single y value. So if you look at the y value here, on f of x, it's at 5. If you subtract 4 from it, it goes down to 1. The perception is that this graph, or at least this one point, it moved down 4 places. Well, I mean, that's also true for this point. And it's also true for this point. The picture is starting to get kind of messy. There's a lot going on. But every point is moving down 4 places. And that's because we subtracted 4 from every single y value. So in terms of how do these two functions relate, I would say the graph of g is the graph of f, but it's been moved down 4 places. So we'll say the graph of g is down 4 from f. So that's very informal, but it is describing what is happening in this picture.